Iran could be described as a very misunderstood country. In the West, Iran has been painted as a destabilizing, warmongering dictatorship by both governments and media. Unlike Qatar, Israel, or Turkey, Iran has little to no means of presenting its version of events through a large English-speaking media outlet. In the predominantly Sunni Arab world, the Shia Islamist Iran is also often a target of vigorous propaganda, and it doesn't help that the response of Iran is more often than not also vigorous propaganda. At a first glance, it can seem Iran has almost nothing but enemies. All recent US administrations had hostile relations with Tehran, who seems to be the only regional power willing to confront Israel, be it mainly indirectly through Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, and other groups. Its Arab neighbors to the south are fighting a proxy war with Iran in Yemen. In the east, relations with both Afghanistan and Pakistan have been tense to say the least, not only due to religious differences but also because of ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliated groups raining havoc in the borderlands of all three countries. However, Iran's foreign policy is way more complicated than that. The purpose of this series is to reveal the real complexity behind Iran's foreign relations through exploring the history and current capabilities of both Iran and its sphere of influence, the so-called axis of resistance. This prologue episode focuses on the creation of modern Iran in the 70s and 80s, the Iranian Revolution, its many factions, and the establishment and survival of the Islamic Republic in the face of war and isolation. The 20th century history of Iran is full of suffering at the hands of foreign powers. In World War I, Persia served as a battleground for the Ottomans, Brits, and Russians. Millions of Persians perished due to famine and disease, which is a hotly contested topic to this day, as the historian Mohammad Gholi Masht contested the traditionally accepted figure of 2 million with an estimate of 8 to 10 million. Iran's central geography and rich oil reserves made it a victim of yet another invasion during World War II. While Britain occupied the south, including its oil fields, the Soviets occupied the north. The majority of infrastructure, including railways, trains, and trucks, was used for the Lend-Lease program, which made distribution of food practically impossible. The British occupation zone came to be known as the Famine Zone. A typhus outbreak made the entire situation even worse, with the death toll once again being a matter of debate, though the most complete analysis to date concludes an estimate of up to 4 million perishing due to hunger and disease. Iran's rich reserves of oil, estimated to be the third largest in the world, came to be both a blessing and a curse for Tehran. The one profiting was mainly the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and the unequal partnership between London and Tehran led to the Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalizing the oil industry and establishing the National Iranian Oil Company. The response from Britain was a blockade on export of Iranian oil, which led to a financial crisis. The ruler of Iran, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who replaced his father on the Iranian throne after the 1941 invasion, organized 2 attempts to get rid of Mossadegh, both of which failed. The Shah then fled the country, but in August 1953, a CIA-organized coup overthrew the government and allowed the Shah to return, which started more than a 20-year-long period of dictatorship. In this period, Pahlavi-ruled Iran became an integral part of the American sphere, a key ally of Israel, and a barricade against the spread of Soviet influence into the Middle East. It is in context of these events that the seeds of revolution were planted deep in Iranian society, and anti-government factions started growing. The label of revolution is put on a lot of events in the 20th and 21st century. Unlike the word coup or regime change, which have a more negative connotation, revolution is seen as something more just, something that comes from the masses rather than a group of individuals. The term was further bastardized by those governments that started labeling sets of reforms and policies as revolution. A perfect example of these are the Cultural Revolution in socialist Albania and the White Revolution in Pahlavi Iran. The truth is, actual revolutions are rather a rare thing. For a revolution to take place, the government needs to antagonize multiple classes of society, which is exactly what took place in Pahlavi Iran. Shah's White Revolution was a set of policies that was supposed to prevent a Red Revolution by gaining support of the peasantry. This was to be done by constructing infrastructure, raising standard of living, and most importantly, land redistribution. In reality, most peasants gained little to no land. Bad living conditions in the countrysides persisted throughout the 60s, with many people living outside of cities having no access to electricity and schools. The government set prices on agricultural products further favored the cities at the expense of the farmers. Tehran, on the other hand, became one of the wealthiest cities in the region, offering a wide array of work opportunities. By the mid-70s, it was the capital city, where half of Iran's manufacturing was located. 1 in 9 residents of Tehran owned a car. In the rest of the country, there was 1 car owner per 90 people. The White Revolution did have its successes. Namely, the new schools and educational programs increased the literacy rate from 26 to 42%. However, increases in the population of young, educated Iranians flooding to Tehran from the countryside quadrupled the size of the two groups most often tied with the downfall of Pahlavi Iran, the working class and the intelligentsia. With both the cities and the countryside growing hostile to the Pahlavi regime, 3 main opposition factions emerged. First group was the Democratic Movement, represented mostly by the National Front and the Freedom Movement. These organizations see themselves as following the path laid out by Mossadegh and gained a large following especially in the diaspora, in France and the United States. While the Democratic Movement was full of factionalism, it was nowhere near the diversity of the second faction, the left. It wasn't just Marxism that gained popularity in Iran among the left-leaning crowd. A new ideology, known as Red Shiism, based on the work of Ali Shariati, came to prominence with an unapologetically revolutionary interpretation of Shia Islam. Shariati justified his political opinions based on the Shiite history of martyrdom and resistance. In many ways, Red Shiism is similar to the Latin American idea of liberation theology. In the 60s, Shariati's ideas gave rise to the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran. The secular left, inspired by revolutionary struggles in Vietnam, China, and Algeria, also made its move. Traditionally, most leftists in Iran were loyal to the Communist Tudeh party, but that changed in the 70s, when some of its younger members, as well as more radical elements of the National Front, formed the People's Fedayeen guerrillas. Both of the above-mentioned leftist organizations started violent struggle against the Pahlavi regime long before the revolution kicked off. The third faction, which ended up shaping Iran's future the most, were of course the Islamists, headed by Ayatollah Khomeini, who spent the 60s and the 70s living in exile. Islamism is often misunderstood outside of the Muslim world. It is by no means a single united movement. The only thing that unites Islamists is the belief that Islam is inherently political, and therefore it is both a religion and a political system to be implemented. The most popular Islamist movement in the Shia branch of Islam is Khomeinism, with its main piece of theory being Khomeini's book Islamic Government, and the main project putting said theory in practice being the Islamic Republic of Iran itself. Khomeini justifies Islamism by the argument that since all Muslims accept the Quran and the Sunnah, it means that it is precisely the law found in these texts that should form the basis of a Muslim state. While it's easy for a non-Muslim to reject these ideas, it's still important to understand why they were and remain popular in Iran. First up, what is a simple book for an atheist, Christian, or Hindu is divine law for a Muslim. Second, what Khomeini wrote in his book was directly relatable to the populace of Iran. Khomeini was vehemently anti-monarchy at the time when the Pahlavi dynasty was spending tens of millions of dollars on televised festivities and parties with foreigners, while the wider population lived in poverty. Khomeini argues that since the Prophet lived in poverty, there is no place for palaces, servants, and monarchs in Islam. As an alternative to imperial monarchy, followers of Khomeini prefer an Islamic Republic, and Khomeinism is therefore not a rejection of all things modern. In the words of Naim Qasim, the current General Secretary of Hezbollah, Islam has set guidelines for the good governor or leader while leaving the choice of government framework up to that leader. As such, electing a president could be through direct popular vote or through a parliament. So is the question of forming a government left free of strict rules. The existence of any form of government, its membership, role assignment, or authority are all issues left to choice. Likewise, there is no interference with the chosen method for electing representative members, whether these are individuals or groups or in any other form. Islam thus permits the creation of what is deemed to be an appropriate setup for each epoch. By the late 70s, revolution could already be felt in the air. In 1976, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, a member of the Democratic faction in exile, published the 50 Years of Treason. This became one of the most important texts of the upcoming revolution. In 1977, the Shah faced ever-growing pressure from the human rights-focused administration of American President Jimmy Carter. Therefore, the Pahlavi regime was forced to allow more opposition opinions to reach their way to the Iranian public. As a result, more and more Iranians had access to literature critiquing the regime. In January 1978, the government media published an article attacking Khomeini, accusing him of being both a reactionary and a communist, as well as Indian. In response, a student protest swept through the streets of Qom and clashed with the authorities near the local police station. The protest ended in tragedy, and while the government claimed 2 dead protesters, the opposition claimed 70. As is often the case, the trend of widely different casualty claims from the government and the opposition continued throughout the entirety of the revolution. However, that was not the end, as the protests were repeated 3 times in February, March and May. The police started sending tanks into the cities, and the 3rd protest, especially bloody, caused the death of multiple demonstrators, with the government claiming 22 casualties and the opposition 250. The most controversial event of the entire revolution happened in August 1978, when in an arson attack, almost 400 people were killed in cinema wrecks in the city of Abadan. Because attacks on cinemas were something the Islamists have done in the past, most scholars outside of Iran tend to claim that it was done by a group of hardcore Islamists. Nonetheless, the public at the time was already distrustful of the government to the point that it suspected the Savak, Shah's secret police, even though the motivation of such an attack from the side of the regime would have to either be an act of pure bloodlust or an attempt at a false flag attack. On September 4, 1978, a protest organized by the clergy erupted in Tehran with hundreds of thousands of attendees. While peaceful, this had the effect of alerting the Shah and the authorities to the fact that the public truly is against him, and the following protest on September 7th convinced the regime to declare martial law. The declaration was issued on Friday, September 8th, the same day another protest was about to take place. This time, soldiers fired into the crowd with automatic weapons, killing and injuring many. The day came to be known as Black Friday, and while modern estimates lean towards a relatively conservative number of around 80 victims, this was very far from the number in minds of the Iranian public. In events similar to the Romanian Revolution, casualties were greatly exaggerated, as the public was distrustful of the official sources. November saw the organization of massive strikes combined with protests and destruction of Pahlavi statues, banks, and services for tourists. The regime was unable to survive the winter. The opposition regularly organized protests with millions of attendees, and the Shah fled the country in January. On February 1st, 1979, Khomeini returned from exile, welcomed by a crowd of more than 3 million supporters. What followed was a brief period of chaos in the capital, and on February 11th, the radio finally announced that the Islamic Revolution was successful. Keep in mind, though officially called the Islamic Revolution, the process was a result of many factions cooperating. The left, the Democrats and the Islamists had a very difficult challenge ahead of them, the formation of a new state. Even before talks about the new constitution started, cracks in the revolutionary alliance already started appearing. Everyone was in favor of a republic. The question was, what sort of a republic? When it came to the issue of naming the new state, the Islamists demanded an Islamic Republic, the leftists a People's Democratic Republic, and the Democrats sought a compromise in the form of a Democratic Islamic Republic. Khomeini insisted on keeping the referendum a simple yes or no choice on the creation of the Islamic Republic, claiming that there is nothing undemocratic about Islam. Khomeini got his way, and the referendum was boycotted by a large portion of the left, some Democrats and also the Kurds. But even without the boycott, the result, an overwhelming yes, would likely stay the same. After all, the Islamists were the most popular faction. The constitution created was a sort of compromise between the Islamists and the Democrats. On the one hand, the supreme leader enjoys the freedom to intervene in pretty much every aspect of the state. Such a powerful position can understandably have catastrophic consequences when handled poorly. The first supreme leader, also called jurist theologian, was of course Khomeini. While this feature obviously can't be ignored, the rest of the constitution is relatively democratic, especially for Middle Eastern standards. Men and women have the right to vote anonymously for president, the assembly and other institutions. Reserved seats in the assembly were distributed to religious minorities, that being Assyrians, Jews, Armenians and Zoroastrianists. The Islamic Republic is therefore a state somewhere between a theocracy and democracy. It is also at this time that Khomeini started creating militias. The Islamists enjoyed broad popular support, but when it came to strength, some of the leftist organizations which fought against the regime for more than a decade at this point posed a real danger to Khomeini's vision. Mujahideen of the Islamic Revolution were established in April to combat a potential seizure of power from the left. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the RGC, were established in May to prevent a potential army coup. More information will be given in the next video that will focus on the IRGC and the army specifically. The United States went into the 70s with two of the three most powerful countries of the Gulf as allies, but by the end of the decade only Saudi Arabia remained. Pahlavi Iran was replaced by a firmly anti-Western Islamic Republic. The relations between the US and Iran further deteriorated in October 1979, when a group of students, most of them aligned to the Islamist movement, started occupying the American embassy. Most of the Americans present were taken hostage, while few were able to seek shelter in the Swiss and Canadian embassies. It is not likely that this very radical action was planned by Khomeini, but denouncing the students would very likely be seen as anti-revolutionary, and the next day Khomeini gave the students his support. Mehdi Bazargan, the prime minister, understood that this action was a diplomatic nightmare, but because the embassy takeover was supported by both the leftists and the Islamists, nothing could be done, and Bazargan resigned in protest. Throughout the Cold War, Iran's main supplier of weapons was the United States. After the revolution, Tehran faced armed uprisings of various intensities among its Kurdish, Arab, and Turkmen regions. It goes without saying that getting spare parts for planes and tanks proved to be incredibly difficult, especially after the US responded with heavy sanctions to the hostage crisis. Luckily, these were minor conflicts and Iran had a large stockpile of weaponry. The only thing that could drain such a stockpile would be a major land war, which is unfortunately exactly what happened. Iraq and Iran already fought a brief war over the Shatt al-Arab waterway in the early 70s, but it wasn't the only dispute. Baghdad had long seen the Iranian region of Khuzestan, with its majority Arab population, as an integral part of Iraq, taken from it under the Ottomans. Iraq, newly under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, shared Iran's anti-Western and anti-Zionist rhetoric, but the two states found themselves in positions of de facto ideological rivals. The secular Iraqi regime, under the control of the Ba'ath Party, was directly threatened by Shia Islamism, even more so due to the oppression of the Shiites under Saddam. Not all historians believe that the main motivation for Saddam's invasion was the fear of the Islamic Revolution spreading to Iraq. Some see it first and foremost as opportunism, motivated by the fact that Iraq, for the first time in decades, found itself in a situation of having a destabilized and isolated eastern neighbor. A sort of once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Saddam. Saddam's decision makes more sense when put into context of the time. The plan to unite Syria and Iraq failed, as the Ba'ath Party of Syria was unwilling to make itself a mere extension of Iraq. Saddam's vision of Iraq taking the leadership of the Arab world was threatened by a potential encirclement by a Syrian-Iranian alliance, the beginning of which he observed already in December 1979. Convinced that the Iranian army was in a terrible state, Saddam decided that an armed conflict was the only way forward. Already in late summer of 1980, the Iraqi-Iranian border was changed into a battleground with frequent clashes on land, sea, and in the air. However, the official start of the conflict is September 22nd, the day when Iraqi planes carried out their first mission deep into Iranian territory. The war lasted for almost 8 years, with a death toll in the hundreds of thousands. It is not the purpose of this video to cover the war in detail. Instead, I want to close out with how the Islamic Republic was even capable of surviving such an invasion. For the vast majority of Iran, this was a war of very obvious Iraqi aggression, and therefore there was an abundance of people flocking to join the army or the Revolutionary Guards. In the West, the war is often talked about as a war of two dictatorships, with the best outcome being the weakening and demise of both regimes. While yes, for the interests of the United States, prolonged conflict was preferred, still, it needs to be said that the propaganda painted around the Iranian war effort doesn't reflect reality. First up, though the frequent usage of chemical weapons by Saddam's army against civilian and military targets is acknowledged, it is almost never talked about without also mentioning Iranian war crimes, namely the usage of child soldiers. While there are records of Iranian soldiers in the age of 13 or younger, we are mostly talking about 15, 16, and 17-year-old volunteers in a country, and also a religious group, where the definition of adulthood is very different. These were considered men defending their country. When looking for mistakes in the Iranian war effort, the discussion should instead shift to Tehran's decision to prolong the war after initial victories. The goal shifted from defense of Iran to establishing an Islamic Republic in Iraq. Second, the Iran that entered the war wasn't the same as the Iran that came out of the conflict. Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, the president and a member of the Democratic faction, got into a conflict with the Islamist faction and was impeached in 1981. In the 2 years prior, the Democrats and leftists weren't able to cooperate on key issues, which often led to the larger Islamist faction being able to go through with its plans. However, during the power struggle between Khomeini and Bani Sadr, the political landscape shifted again. Namely, the freedom movement didn't side with Bani Sadr and the National Front during the protest. Instead, the People's Mujahideen declared their support for the president. Not all of the clergy wished to see Bani Sadr gone. However, the situation in the capital spiraled into violence and Khomeini's Islamic Republican Party was able to prevail. While this meant the end for Bani Sadr's faction, the People's Mujahideen, by this time with years of experience in guerrilla warfare, started an insurgency in Iran, and especially Tehran, which lasted throughout the entirety of the war. Eventually, they relocated to Iraq and continued their campaign from there. Some of the secular left also didn't manage to survive the 80s. At the beginning of the war, the Soviet Union sold weapons to both sides, Iraq and Iran. Moscow also sponsored the Tudeh Communist Party. A Soviet defector to Britain revealed the scale of the Soviet spy network in Iran. After London handed this information over to Tehran, the government went ahead with yet another purge, making the Tudeh party effectively irrelevant. Iran therefore survived the war politically, though the Islamists and the freedom movement were effectively the only factions left before the political landscape shifted once again in the late 80s. Militarily, Iran was able to find sources to replenish their arsenal at both expected and unexpected places. First up, Beijing and Pyongyang were key sellers. Iran bought more than $4 billion worth of Chinese and North Korean weaponry during the war. The most loyal ally of Iran during this time proved to be Syria, which stopped buying oil from Iraq and instead started importing it from Iran. It was also through Syria that Tehran was able to establish smuggling routes to supply pro-Iranian militias in Iraq. Saddam's war had many sponsors. The Gulf states felt threatened by the Islamic Revolution, and Saudi Arabia alone supported Iraq with more than $20 billion. For the United States, both a strong Iraq and a strong Iran were terrible options, but the establishment of an Islamic Republic in Iraq was seen as the worst possible outcome. The Iraqi inventory consisted mainly of Eastern Bloc weaponry, but the Soviet Union alone wasn't able to satisfy the demand. Therefore, the United States stepped in and started buying weapons from Eastern European black markets, supplying them to Iraq. As previously stated, it was in the interests of both Israel and the US to prolong the war. For obvious reasons, Israel felt threatened by the Iraqi nuclear program, and in 1981 succeeded in destroying the Osirak nuclear reactor south of Baghdad. The USA played its part by orchestrating what would later be known as the Iran-Contra affair. The US sanctions prevented the Reagan administration from legally selling arms to Iran, whose largely American arsenal of weaponry was in desperate need of spare parts. In the end, the arms sales were conducted secretly, through Israel. Tel Aviv bought the weapons from the US and the profits were then sent to militias in Nicaragua. This was genius because the Reagan administration was able to bypass the Congress that had forbidden direct funding to the Contras militias. As it's part of the deal, Iran also used its influence in Lebanon to free some American hostages. The takeaway from this is that Iran was taught how to survive under sanctions and isolation, which is something the country excels in up to this day. The purpose of this prologue episode was to give some crucial context for the rest of the series. Many of the factions talked about have since splintered, changed, lost relevancy, while new factions emerge, and Iran today is once again a very different country. The People's Mujahideen, for example, changed their ideological outlook drastically and today remain as a small group operating from their base in Albania. While I might touch on the Iranian current internal politics here and there, starting from episode 1 we will focus mainly on foreign relations, partners and capabilities of the Iranian sphere of influence. However, we will stay in Iran for the first episode, which will cover the subject of Iran's two armies, the Artesh and the IRGC. This is my first video on the channel, so if you have any feedback, please let me know. I'd greatly appreciate it. The Axis of Resistance is only the first series in what will hopefully become a channel focusing on current affairs in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, Africa and East Asia. Take care.